The U.S. aircraft carrier George Washington, steaming in the Western Pacific. One visible symbol of what's been dubbed the pivot. The Obama administration's move to bolster the American military, diplomatic, and economic presence in Asia.
After a decade in which we fought two wars that cost us dearly in blood and treasure, the United States is turning our attention to the vast potential of the Asia-Pacific region. As President, I have therefore made a deliberate and strategic decision. As a Pacific nation, the United States will play a larger and long-term role in shaping this region and its future.
The focus on Asia began at the start of the Obama administration.
There is a very broad and deep acknowledgement that the history of the 21st century is going to be written in the Asian Pacific region. You know, the most dynamic economies, largest growing middle classes, tremendous potential for prosperity, and an absolutely unique American role.
The shift was partly a reaction to what was widely seen as the Bush administration's neglect of Asia, preoccupation with Iraq and Afghanistan. Jeffrey Bader handled Asian affairs for Obama at the National Security Council.
Understandably, the war on terror had preoccupied the Bush administration. The war in Iraq had diverted U.S. resources and attention for the better part of a decade. So we began from day one with this placing greater emphasis on Asia, and it had multiple dimensions to it. When President Obama went on his first trip to Asia in November of 2009, he talked about the U.S. as a Pacific country, and the Obama administration talked about President Obama as our first Pacific president.
But the new U.S. strategy gained momentum and a significant shift in focus during 2010 and 2011 against the backdrop of the rise of China.
With the re-rise of China on the world stage is going to be probably the most important event we face in the first half of this century.
In the wake of the financial meltdown in 2008 and the problems we were having, there was an increasing view in China that the U.S. was in decline. And many Chinese began believing their own press clippings about China's rise, and a small segment of China's sort of elite began arguing that, you know, our time, meaning China's time, had come. Time for China to assert itself more actively and more aggressively.
It was a view widely expressed at the time inside China.
For China, we are getting more power. Yes, we can more assert our rights.
Rising powers have a common pattern of activity and of psychological attitudes. They're more self-confident, they're more assertive, they want other countries to pay more respect for their interests as defined by themselves, and they have a tendency to want to throw their weight around. The Chinese are showing those characteristics.
They were on display as China forcefully asserted its claims to sovereignty over most of the South China Sea, which is also claimed by several Southeast Asian nations, in steadily expanding military expenditures and capabilities. In heightened tensions with Japan over what Beijing calls the Diaoyu and Tokyo calls the Senkaku Islands, tensions which in the late summer of 2012 erupted into a full-blown crisis after the Japanese government purchased the islands, prompting an angry Chinese response, including violent anti-Japanese demonstrations across China. The latest manifestation of an increasingly strident form of Chinese nationalism.
I think we are seeing, for instance, on issues related to sovereignty from their perspective, a very tough and in some respects unyielding set of positions that have been animated by nationalist sentiment.
These developments spark concern not only in Washington, but in the rest of Asia as well.
Our friends and allies, not only allies, friends throughout the region came to us and said, you need to step up your game because the Chinese are becoming very worrisome. And keep in mind, this is at a time when we're still in a fragile state in the wake of the financial crisis. If we simply sat back and said, no, I'm sorry, that isn't what we're all about, the signal in Asia would be that we're on the way out and they had better adjust to the Chinese priorities.
The upshot was the pivot.
The main dynamic of this administration in dealing with Asia is the discovery that China is more assertive than they thought when they came into office. And this is one of the responses.
The new policy has three key elements: greater diplomatic engagement, with senior U.S. officials crisscrossing the region to boost relations with friends and allies, and the U.S. seeking an expanded role in regional institutions.
One of the things that we've sought to do is to engage very actively in multilateral institutions like the East Asia Summit and the ASEAN Regional Forum, where all countries are together.
It also involves expanded economic ties, including a proposed free trade zone called the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
The good part about it, I think about it, is that it's kind of a 21st century trade agreement. We finally realize that we got to look at ASEAN and the region much more seriously than we've done before, and this is a way to do it.
What's gotten the most attention, however, and sparked the most controversy, has been the American effort to boost its military presence in Asia.
The plan is for the Navy to reconfigure its forces from the current 50-50 split between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans to having 60% of its assets here in the Pacific. It will involve deploying 6 aircraft carriers, destroyers, littoral combat ships, submarines, and an increase in military exercises and port visits.
In the spring of 2012, for example, the U.S. Navy staged a large joint training exercise with the Philippines, which has been locked in a tense dispute with China over rival claims to parts of the South China Sea. And senior U.S. and Philippine officials talked of strengthened defense ties amid blunt language clearly aimed at China.
We oppose the threat or use of force by any party to advance its claims.
Meanwhile, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta visited Vietnam, forging new security ties with an old enemy that now has its own tensions with China over the South China Sea. To highlight the increasingly close links between Washington and Hanoi, Panetta even made a highly publicized stop at Cam Ranh Bay, which had been one of the biggest American bases during the Vietnam War.
We're forging with Japan, Australia, and South Korea new missile defense approaches. We're focused on building the Philippines' maritime security presence and capabilities and strengthening their maritime domain awareness. We're integrating roles, missions, and capabilities with Japan and taking numerous steps to solidify and strengthen our enduring presence on the Korean Peninsula. We're deepening our security cooperation, technology sharing, and defense trade with India.
Underpinning the new focus on Asia is a new strategic concept, which the Pentagon calls air-sea battle, an effort to integrate U.S. naval and air forces to counter the ability of China or any other adversary to curtail U.S. operational capabilities in the Pacific.
We think there's a good strategic, operational, tactical, and institutional value for air-sea battle. The anti-access area denial is not the only challenge to naval and air forces, but it's probably the defining challenge today and as we view it in the near future.
There is a military challenge that needs to be faced. I mean, China has been increasing its military expenditures at between 12 and 15% per year for close to 2 decades. And it has acquired military capabilities in areas of medium-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, submarines, the ability to have an effective military response to activities within, let's say, 1,000 miles of its shore, which it did not have before.
It's interdiction. For example, it's the People's Liberation Army trying to figure out ways in which to interdict United States military forces operating in the Western Pacific in a given scenario.
So this talk about the air-sea battle has to do with what kind of doctrinal alterations are required by this increase in Chinese capabilities and what kind of increase in U.S. capabilities. or altered U.S. capabilities are required in response.
Not surprisingly, the robust U.S. moves in Asia have not gone down well in Beijing. Jia Xiaodong served at the Chinese embassy in Washington for many years.
Actually, many people in China believe that this rebalancing, realignment of U.S. strategy towards forces towards the Asia-Pacific region is to contain China. Many people here in China believe that at least part of the policy is directed at China. When they look at what the U.S. is doing and will do, for example, the strengthening of its military alliances in the region.
Indeed, the notion that the U.S. is trying to contain the rise of China has now become a widely accepted narrative in the Chinese press, think tanks, and on the streets, and it's fueled an increasingly sharp anti-American tone in much of the public discussion in China.
There's certainly a strain that says the U.S. is coming at us. They're trying to contain us. They're doing that militarily. They're doing it economically with the TPP, this Trans-Pacific Partnership notion, and that we have to be tougher to protect our interests. And this certainly feeds nationalist rhetoric among some in China.
From a Chinese point of view, if you looked at the countries China has problems with, Vietnam, India, Japan, in some sense, sometimes South Korea. The U.S. is cultivating relationships with the countries China has the most problems. And therefore, I can see how they see basically where we have problems, that's where the U.S. is trying to strengthen.
Chinese officials and scholars reject the notion that Beijing is to blame for heightened regional tensions, saying the activities of other countries have forced China into a more assertive posture.
Some people talked about China's so-called aggressiveness or assertiveness in the region or beyond. Actually, that's a kind of, I believe, it's a kind of wrong depiction of China's action, let alone policy. Chinese government is actually under great pressure when the Philippines, Vietnam, try to infringe upon China's claimed rights. For example, in the South China Sea.
The alliance between the United States and Japan has been a cornerstone of our relationship, but also for security in the Asia-Pacific region for a very long time.
For their part, U.S. officials steadfastly insist that the pivot is not aimed just at China, but has a much broader focus.
I clearly think that China is a giant factor in the foreign policy of the United States and will continue to be. But this focus on Asia is not, as some have suggested, some sort of containment plan. That's simplistic and wrong.
When the administration said it's not about China, it's all about China. China knows this.
And the military aspect, in Beijing's eyes, is especially worrisome.
If you're sitting in China, who would an air-sea battle be devoted against except you? So it gives lie to successive protestations by administrations that this is not about China.
But it's more complex than just containment, or, for that matter, just engagement, because the U.S.-China relationship is vastly more complex.
The United States has a relationship with China that is one of mutual dependence. We have enormous trade with China. We did not have it with the Soviet Union.
Our exports to China have doubled in the last several years. Our trade is increasing sharply. Two-way investment is increasing. We have hundreds of thousands of Chinese students who've studied in the United States. To posit the notion that what we're seeking is some sort of containment of China, I don't know how one squares that with a president who's had 12 meetings with Hu Jintao. That is not the diplomacy of a country that's seeking to contain another.
But even Washington's choice of the word pivot has been a source of tension with China.
The pivot is the wrong term, and I think most people have realized that, although it's already taken hold.
Some administration officials use the word pivot, a vocabulary which, by the way, I don't think is the best way to refer to U.S. policy. The word pivot, to some ears, has a bit of a military ring to it.
The words have become synonymous with containment, and that's counterproductive.
In response, U.S. officials now usually describe what's happening not as a pivot, but as a, quote, rebalancing.
I want to speak to you about a broader topic, and that is our defense strategy and budget, and particularly the defense aspects of our so-called rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region.
Another big question about the pivot is how will the U.S. pay for it at a time of budget constraints and cuts in defense spending? Indeed, some analysts argue that one of the key reasons underlying the whole concept of the pivot was a desire to ensure that the U.S. military posture in Asia is not too badly affected by those cuts.
The rebalancing was an effort basically to save the budget for the Asia-Pacific when the rest of the defense budget was about to be cut.
And yet, even with all these question marks and ambiguities, the tension in the relationship has increasingly come to define the public narrative on both sides.
China is stealing American ideas and technology, everything from computers to fighter jets. 7 times Obama could have taken action. 7 times he said no. His policies cost us 2 million jobs.
I'm Mitt Romney, and I approve this message.
The U.S. presidential campaign, both Mitt Romney
tough on China, not Mitt Romney,
and Barack Obama have accused the other of being soft on China.
The Chinese have been part of this campaign. When you have an economic problem, you've got to blame somebody, so why not blame the Chinese?
Romney has vowed to designate China as a currency manipulator on the day he takes office.
Well, I hope he will not do it if he gets elected to the White House. That's equivalent to a declaration of war, trade war with China.
While there's an implication that we're going to change the way we'll deal with China, with people posturing as to how tough they're going to be on China, in reality, I think they'll find that because of the interconnectedness between our two economies, when we're tough on China in this area of our economic relationship, China can be tough on us in another area of our economic relationship, and you end up with a wash, or you end up actually damaging your own interests more than you're inflicting damage on the other side.
You don't treat China as an enemy. Otherwise, if you treat China as an enemy, you end up to have an enemy in China.
Since 1980, China has frequently been an issue in presidential campaigns, from Ronald Reagan denouncing Jimmy Carter's moves to break relations with Taiwan and normalize with Beijing, to candidate Bill Clinton in 1992.
An America that will not coddle tyrants from Baghdad to Beijing.
To George W. Bush attacking the Clinton administration for seeing China as a strategic partner and not a strategic competitor. To both Obama and Senator John McCain attacking China in 2008. Whoever wins, though, history suggests the need to manage such a complex and hugely important relationship will serve to reduce the risk that tensions could get out of control on both sides.
We've been through many U.S. elections and administrations. So generally people are not unfamiliar with the rhetoric during the elections, and we've been often told also by U.S. friends that for some of the rhetorics just don't pay attention to that and forget about it because that's for the domestic audience. However, they do have implications for the bilateral relation.
The Romney campaign declined our request to interview one of the candidate's Asia policy advisors. But Richard Armitage, who served as Deputy Secretary of State under George W. Bush, believes there will be more continuity in a Romney administration than the campaign rhetoric might suggest.
The people who were on the Romney campaign, who are Asia folks, are very well known to you and to me. The great majority are very solid, I don't hesitate to use the word traditional, realpolitik folks who actually have a good deal of time in Asia. So I think if Romney were to win, Asia policy would be relatively untouched.
Kenneth Lieberthal, who handled China policy on Bill Clinton's National Security Council, isn't so sure.
Because I don't know how serious he is in the comments he's made about China to date. If you look back at his history, when he's held major positions as head of Beijing, as the savior of the Olympics, as governor of Massachusetts, he's been a very pragmatic, very effective executive. If you look at what he has said in the political campaign across an array of issues, I think, frankly, it's hard to regard many of the statements as pragmatic or likely to be effective. So the question is the Romney of a political campaign going to be the Romney in office? If a President Romney comes in and immediately declares China to be a currency manipulator and takes other steps like that, I think we're going to have a few years of very tough ties.
Whoever wins, much will also depend on the new Chinese leadership unveiled at a Communist Party Congress in November. Americans who've met Xi Jinping, the new top leader, are hopeful.
Vice President Biden has spent dozens of hours with Vice President Xi, and I think our sense is that this is a person who's committed to continuing a strong relationship between China and the United States.
Moreover, even the other Asian nations who've supported the more robust U.S. role in the region don't want to be forced to choose between the U.S. and China.
China's rise has benefited all of the countries around China, and they don't want a containment policy against China. But at the same time, they're worried that a stronger China may begin to be more assertive and more demanding of them, and they don't want a hegemonic China either. And so therefore they look to the United States to play a balancing role.
But playing a balancing role requires a tricky balancing act. At a time when both China and the U.S. face unprecedented internal challenges, both economic and political.
Both countries have the strain of confronting really unusually large and difficult economic tasks that they have to take on, and at the same time being economically mutually interdependent. That complexity makes everyone nervous and imparts a kind of a fraught dimension to the relationship. The fundamental reality is we are the two largest economies in the world for decades to come. We had better figure out how to make this work between the two of us.